Hi everyone, this is Yana Smakula for SimonsStamp.com and thank you for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to show you how you can stretch your everyday critter stamps and use them for holiday card making, and I'll also show you how you can use Copic markers to color on watercolor paper. So think about all those fun critter stamp sets that are released all the way throughout the year and are being neglected around the holiday season because they're not holiday themed. Well, you can play some quick and easy dress up and get your critters ready for Christmas. I have several stamp sets I'll be using today to create this card, and one of them, the main stamp set, the critter stamp set, is the stacking animals. I remember when this set first came out a few months ago, and it quickly became a favorite of many card makers. I actually never got around to using it on a card, and this is actually the first time I'll be playing with this stamp set. If you don't have this particular set, look through your stash and I'm sure you'll find some cute panda or crocodile or dog to dress up and look all silly and funny on a holiday project. I'll be using Giraffe from here and also both of the birds, and I'll color the birds red to look like robins. To dress up my critters for the holidays, I'm going to use a few clothing pieces. I have two stamp sets from where I'll use a scarf and reindeer antlers. And by the way, never mind the labels on my clear pockets, they are messed up. Now these are my go-to stamp sets when I want to add a holiday accessory to my stamped images. So basically, I'll use just a few extra winter elements to prep my everyday critters for the holiday season. And you don't necessarily have to use these particular sets. I simply love them because there are a lot of little things that I can use to dress up my characters. There are many other sets like these where you can find scarf, mittens, hats, and even skis. I'll be using watercolor paper today, and I'll also use Copic markers. This is not your typical paper for alcohol markers, but you can get pretty good results on this type of paper when using Copics. And I'll talk more about this when I get to the coloring part of my video. I'm going to use my mini Misti stamp positioner to do my stamping, and I'm using it for several reasons. First, watercolor paper is usually textured, so the first impression is rarely perfect, so you need to double stamp images or even triple stamp them. And the second reason is actually rather silly. I've gotten into a habit of using this tool and double and triple stamping all of my images. So it's just a reflex for me now. So I'm going to position the images I want to stamp inside my Misti. I already have my paper there, and I've placed a giraffe, two birds, a smaller and a bigger bird, a scarf, and reindeer antlers, and I'm going to ink up my images with Simons Intense Black ink. This is a waterproof ink, so you can use it with watercolors and with alcohol markers. At this point, when I was doing my stamping, I actually wasn't 100% sure what coloring method I was going to use, so I decided to use this particular ink just to be safe. Whatever coloring medium I would pick, I could still have nice and crisp outlines. Now, the reason I decided to do Copic coloring on watercolor paper is because how thin the outlines of my images are. When I color with Copic markers, the ink tends to bleed and go outside the lines a lot. It's not a problem on images where the outlines are thicker, but on these, where the lines are very thin and fine, I was afraid my ink would bleed all over the place and I'll just end up being frustrated with my coloring. On this watercolor paper, because this paper is designed to absorb and hold more water or more alcohol liquid, I find it easier for me to stay within the lines of my images. Now, this being said, I have to point out that this type of paper absorbs a lot more ink. So you will use more ink from your marker compared to the amount of ink you'd use to color the same image on a regular paper. So this is just something to keep in mind. If you're also struggling with your Copic markers bleeding outside your stamped lines, try doing your coloring on watercolor paper. The results might surprise you. Now I'm doing very simple, very basic coloring here. I'm just using a handful of colors. First, I have E33 as my lighter color for the antlers. E37 is my darker color. I'm also using E11 for the top of the ears and R20 to color the inside of the ears. For the birds, I'm going with 4 red markers, and I'm starting with R39 as my darkest color. I'm using R29 as my medium red, R24 as the lighter red, and also the fourth color is R22. You don't need to use this many colors. I simply wanted to have a very dark red going into very light red on the birds. To color the noses of the birds, I used E33 and E11. And to color my giraffe, I actually went on Pinterest and looked up various images of giraffes, as I honestly had no idea how to color him, how to add and where to add spots. So I used YR14 as my dark orange, and because I actually have very little orange markers in my stash, I used E11 as the light orange color, and I added that all over my giraffe. And even though my marker wasn't dry, I actually felt that it was not as juicy as my other markers here. This paper really took a lot of color, a lot of marker, and by coloring an image this big, you can definitely tell the difference between how much marker different kinds of papers can absorb. So I went back to the YR14 color and just drew circles or squares or whatever those shapes are on the back of my giraffe, also in his legs and his neck. You can outline those shapes in black for more definition if you'd like, but I wanted them rather subtle on my image, so I only used that one color of ink, or that one marker. So I cut my images out using coordinating dies and I set them aside. I wanted to have a snowy background, so I used Simon's Falling Snow background stamp and my regular size Misti, and I heat embossed this image onto surf blue cardstock in white puff embossing powder. I first taped my panel, and this panel was cut to 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches, and I taped it down to my Misti. I knew I would not be adding any embossing to the bottom part of the panel, so this is where I added my washi tape and placed my magnets to hold the paper in place. I inked up my stamp using Simon's embossing ink, and I stamped it about 3 times before I was happy with the amount of ink I had on my paper. I wanted my heat embossing to be close to perfect, so this is why I triple stamped this image. Normally I would stamp it just once, but because I really wanted to have those perfect round snow dots on my background, I stamped them that many times. I also forgot to mention that I took the black foam pad out of my Misti so that I could use this cling background stamp. And I'm actually only using my regular size Misti for my 6x6 cling background stamps. So I took that black foam pad out a while ago and I haven't put it back ever since I started using this size Misti. I preheat my heat tool and I melted the powder. I mentioned I was using puff embossing powder. I love it for snow. I actually also used it on a donut image to add frosting to a donut a few months ago, and it looked really, really cool. So it's a great embossing powder to have in your stash. It's something a little different from your regular white or clear. So I used the Big Joy die and die cut Joy out of white cardstock, and the idea for this card was actually born when I imagined my giraffe wearing letter O. So I dressed him up in letter O. I placed J and Y on the sides. I added my birds, and I planned out where I wanted the winter clothing accessories to be. Next, I taped my panel onto my grid paper so that it would be easier for me to align things and have them centered. And from there, I started foam mounting my images onto the panel. I first foam mounted the letters J and Y, and it was nice having that grid paper onto my panel to be able to adhere them on a straight line. Next, I foam mounted my giraffe with the letter O, and I kept adhering the rest of the elements until I had all of them in place. To complete my sentiment, I heat embossed To the World, and this sentiment came from the Big Add-on stamp set, so I heat embossed it in white embossing powder onto red cardstock. I trimmed it into a narrow strip and also foam mounted onto my panel. At this point, I already had my panel adhered onto an A2 top folding card base, so my card was pretty much done. I also added a layer of glossy accents to the eyes of my critters, and that finished this project. I only added one layer, and you can see just one layer on the photos there, but I actually went back and added 2 more layers to have the eyes more dimensional. It was really easy to take a non-holiday critter stamp set and use those critters for a holiday card with the help of a few holiday clothing pieces. So I encourage you to dig through your stash, look for critters and Santa hats, mittens, and things like that, and see if you can dress up your animals for Christmas. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope I was able to inspire you to create. Here's a closer look at this funny giraffe Christmas card. Be sure to give this idea a try and do tag us on social media so we can take a peek at your projects. You can find the list of supplies I used for this project down below and also in the blog post. Be sure to give this video a thumbs up and to subscribe to this channel if you haven't yet done so. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'll see you next time. Bye!